In this talk I'm going to cover in a very introductory way the vexed issue of the observer effect. This is a phenomenon which is revealed by the famous double-slit experiment, which has given rise to much consternation, incomprehension and speculation, as well as New Age overindulgence. To start our discussion, I'm going to leave it to the physicist and TV presenter Jim Al-Khalili to describe the mystery of the double-slit experiment and the claimed observer effect.
But we were hoping to get as much quantum mystery in it as possible. I just wanted to spend a few minutes reminding you of why quantum mechanics is so mysterious. And I'll do it using the famous, as Richard Feynman says, this is the underlying mystery of quantum mechanics, what's called the two-slit experiment. So you thought it was going to be a media-type talk, and it ends up being a physics lecture, but no apologies. Begin with something like light. We know light behaves like waves. So imagine you have a source of light. Now, for the pedants in the audience, you'll note that a light bulb gives off white light, which is light of all wavelengths. Let's pretend this is monochromatic light coming with a particular wavelength. It hits a screen with two slits in. The light squeezes through both slits and then diffracts. It squeezes and spreads out. And as it comes out, each slit will then act as a new source on the other side, and these waves will interfere with each other and give rise to what's called an interference pattern. Now, kids at school do this with the ripple tanks, and it's known that this is a classic property of waves, that they spread out and they give rise to these light and dark fringes. If we do the same experiment again, not with waves, but with particles, and I've chosen here grains of sand. So this is the same experiment, but it's been twisted 90 degrees. So we're allowing gravity to pull the grains of sand through, and you don't get grains of sand going through both slits at the same time. You get them, each grain goes through one slit or the other. So you end up with a double bump rather than lots of bumps of an interference pattern. So there's wave behavior and there's particle behavior. In the quantum world, things are very different. So if you imagine setting up an experiment where we're firing, say, atoms from some source, some atom gun, that shoots a stream of atoms at a screen where the slits are of appropriate width and separation. And to begin with, let's say we know nothing about quantum mechanics. We don't understand what we're going to see, and then we have to try and figure out what's going on. Close one of the slits. The back screen now is some sort of photosensitive screen whereby an atom, when it hits it, it will give off, the material on the surface of the screen will give off a flash of light, so you can see where the atom has landed. Of course, you don't see atoms, they're very small. So the assumption is the pattern here adjacent to the lower slit, there's a bit of a spread. That doesn't necessarily mean there's diffraction going on, because if we don't know anything about atoms, these are tiny, tiny particles. Those that go through the slit without bumping into the edges will go straight through and land somewhere in the middle. You've got a few astray on either side. Maybe they've sort of hit the slit, the edges as they've gone through. A lot of atoms, of course, are just going to be blocked by the first screen. That's fine. There's nothing mysterious or magical or weird about that. The weirdness begins when you open the upper slit. Because what you'd expect to see are two lines for the atoms that have gone through the lower slit and the atoms that have gone through the upper slit. But instead, we see something reminiscent of an interference pattern. It's as though there's wave-like behavior taking place, and yet we've got dots, discrete dots, saying these are discrete atoms that have landed in particular locations on the screen. So what's happening? How are the atoms going through these two slits to give us this pattern? If we don't know anything about atoms and how they behave, you can say, well, atoms must be subject to some forces that, whatever they may be, they're complicated, but they give rise to this pattern. Maybe the atoms are bumping into each other and they're sort of, the interatomic forces are saying, that for whatever reason only a certain number can land together in a particular region, saying, right, me and my crowd are here, you go off somewhere else, and by the way, make sure no one lands in between, for some as yet to be explained rule about the way atoms behave. Well, we can try and discount that argument by not sending through the stream of atoms altogether, but send the atoms through one at a time. And only after a certain time do we send the next one through. So if an atom gets through one or the other of the slits, you'll see a spot of light. But if you don't, that's presumably because it's been blocked by the first screen. So you start off sending one atom at a time, and you see them landing somewhere on the back screen. But as we keep on going, you start to see the interference pattern arrive again. So we've got an interference pattern reminiscent of wave-like behavior. And remember, this pattern, this interference pattern, only comes about because you've got things appearing from both slits and interfering with each other, the waves overlapping. But each atom is going through by itself. So each atom is contributing its small part to an overall interference pattern. So if there's wave-like stuff going on, then each atom is doing that. Each atom is behaving in some way like a wave. So what happens is it does the atom, which comes out as a tiny particle, see the two slits and somehow spread out? Or does it split into two and then they combine again on the other side? Because clearly tiny atoms coming from there, and we have a point at the back, so it's a particle, and here it's a particle, but somewhere in the middle it's doing something that gives rise to wave-like behavior. Well, we can try and be clever, even cleverer. Let's try and spy on the atoms and see what they're up to. What if we were to stick a detector just behind the upper slit? Now, if you know about quantum mechanics, you know the act of the observer affects the outcome of the experiment. So we're going to assume in an idealized situation that we're carrying out a very subtle, weak sort of measurement detection, whereby this detector will flash or bleep if it detects an atom going through the upper slit, but won't if the atom goes through the lower slit. And run the experiment again, one atom at a time. What you find, of course, at the end, is that half of the time, of all the atoms that have got through, half of them triggered the detector and the other half didn't. That means half of them went through the top slit and the other half went through the bottom slit. So it seems they don't go through both slits at once. They go through one slit or the other. But I've not shown you the screen. I've not shown you what the result of this experiment is. And it looks like that. It's different. We've stuck a detector there, and suddenly, yes, indeed, the 50% of the atoms that have got through the upper slit that trigger the detector have landed adjacent to the upper slit. And those that haven't have landed underneath adjacent to the lower slit. So by looking as carefully as we can, it seems that we've changed the behavior of the atoms. Okay. How about if I leave the detector there, but I very quietly go and unplug it, so the atoms don't know. As far as the atoms are concerned, I'm still detecting them, right? So they should still behave the same way. Run the experiment again. Now, I don't know which way they've gone, but I've got the detector there pretending that I'm checking. Run the experiment again. With the detector off, bang, the interference pattern comes back again. It's as though the atoms have arrived on this side of the screen, faced with a choice of going in two ways, but somehow having this psychic ability, no, you've got a detector there and it's on. There's no way you're going to catch me out going both ways at once. I'm going to go through one slit or the other. Turn it off. You can't fool me. I know it's off. Yay, I can do what atoms do when you're not looking and go through both slits at once.
So we see in this clip that Jim Al-Khalili gives a description of one of the fundamental mysteries, conundrums of the double-slit experiment. it seems as if the quantum particles going through the apparatus, either going through both slits or going through one or other of the slits, depending upon whether the detector is off or on. He describes how it seems as if, as he puts it, the particles are psychic. They know what the experiment is doing. If the experimenter has the detector on, then the particles know they're being watched. And so instead of going through both slits as a quantum wave, they turn into particles and just go through one slit. But when the sneaky experimenter goes and turns the detector off, the quantum, now they're not particles, in fact they turn into quantum waves, and they go through both slits and produce an interference effect. And thus Jim Al-Khalidi says that there is the appearance of psychic quantum particles. However, as we shall see, Jim Al-Khalidi himself does not believe the particles are psychic. He's just Jim Al-Khalidi himself, as we shall see, considers that all such phenomena must have a non-psychic, non-mystical, non-consciousness involving explanation. In fact, if we take a look at a book that he wrote, I think this may have been his first book, Quantum, A Guide for the Perplexed, which is a book he wrote before the talk he gave, which the clip is taken from. We read in the introduction the following. When it comes to the world of the quantum, we really are crossing into a quite extraordinary domain. A domain where it seems we are free to choose any one of a number of explanations for what is observed, each of which is, in its own way, astonishingly strange. That it even makes tales of alien abductions sound perfectly reasonable. If only people knew how frustratingly and yet wonderfully unmundane the quantum world really is. How our familiar and solid reality ultimately rests so tenuously on an unfathomably ghostly reality beneath. No need any longer for tales of the Bermuda Triangle or poltergeist activities. Quantum phenomena are much stranger. And while just about every recorded paranormal phenomena or incident can be explained away with no more than a pinch of common sense, quantum theory has been tested, prodded and probed in every imaginable way for nearly 100 years. It is a pity none of the predictions of quantum mechanics made it, as far as I am aware, into an issue of the unexplained. Ooh, weird. Dee 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 dee. So, as Al-Khalili tells us, he's convinced that every paranormal phenomena can be explained away. Notice, explained away. He also considers, as we shall see, psychic phenomena can also be explained away. And by psychic phenomena, what is being referred to here is any phenomena which involves notions of consciousness having anything to do with quantum functioning, or that consciousness has any kind of significance at the quantum level. These are thought to be, for many quantum physicists who veer towards more materialist, I call them subtle materialist explanations, ideas that consciousness are involved in any way within quantum functioning are often called woo-woo. And this indicates this kind of subtle play of insults which is indulged in by materialist quantum physicists and philosophers. But we must note it's very apposite that Jim Al-Khalili uses the term explained away, not explained. When phenomena are explained properly, they have a completely evidentially based, logically coherent chain of logical exposition linking one end of the chain to another. However, things which are explained away are often given a fake logical explanation. This is to say, they're given an explanation which appears plausible to people who don't investigate too deeply, but on deeper inspection, there are some physicists and philosophers who interpret the phenomenon displayed in the double-slit experiment, as outlined by Jim Al-Khalili in the earlier clip, as indicating that there is a role for consciousness in bringing the reality of the particle-like nature into existence. So from this view, it is not so much that the particles or the wave-like nature which exists before particles are manifested indicates some kind of psychic interaction. It really depends on what your definition of the term psychic is, of course. But rather than psychic, the idea is that there's some kind of causal influence of consciousness acting into the quantum realm. Such an idea is deeply, deeply shocking for physicists and philosophers whose intellectual or psychic bent leans more in a materialist direction. In his book, Jim Al-Khalili says that at one time it was even fashionable to talk about a measurement requiring an intelligent, conscious observer. After all, since no one knew where to place the boundary between the quantum domain of wave functions, that's the wavy domain of quantum functioning before particles emerge, and the classical domain of definite outcomes, where the particles suddenly come into existence, when measurements are made, then maybe we should only place a boundary when we really have to. And for some quantum physicists it seemed, and the quantum physicists who stand out in the early days were Eugene Wigner, who later abandoned the idea, and London and Breuer, who suggested that the only place where we are forced to abandon the quantum description is when it registers in our conscious minds. This led to various jokes being made, as when, I think it may have been Einstein or one of his associates, talking about mice collapsing quantum wave functions. Einstein said that he didn't believe that when he left his bedroom the bed spread out into a quantum superposition of possibilities, and when he walked back into his bedroom that the bed suddenly jumped back into its corner. There are quite a few jokes within the debates of quantum theory, quite good ones from time to time. But the point is the idea that in some sense consciousness interacts at the quantum level in order to produce a manifested reality, a quantum particle for instance, from what prior to that situation was just a field of spread out quantum potentialities, was for some a serious proposition. Amit Goswami, for example, an excellent quantum physicist, but many people believe he has lost the plot when it comes to metaphysics, as he's gone far into a kind of New Age perspective. Amit Goswami says, in quantum physics, objects are depicted as possibilities, a possibility wave. Yet when an observer observes, the possibilities collapse into an actuality. The wave collapses into a particle, for example. This is the observer effect. So for Amit Goswami, this is an explanation of what's going on in the situation described by Jim Al-Khalili. And having the detector convey information such that an observer knows what's happening at the slit means that the quantum wave of possibilities collapses and becomes a particle. So observation via the detector collapses the waves of possibility into actuality. This is the claimed observer effect. As a more recent book called Quantum Enigma, written by Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner, says the object was not there before you found it there. Your happening to find it there caused it to be there. And for many quantum physicists and philosophers, this kind of language is just going far too far into the realm of speculative New Age woo-woo. So despite the fact that Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner are physicists themselves, many people have been highly critical of their claims, but they do have supporters. This is a picture that I use in very crude fashion to illustrate what the situation is thought to be. The observer collapses a wave of possibilities and ping! Suddenly a particle manifests into existence. That picture is in a book I'm about to publish. There were quite a few physicists who actually had a view, if not exactly like that, but at least close or in the same ballpark as that. I'll just read a short section from my book, Quantum Buddhism now. So we've just seen or listened to Goswami's view that objects are depicted as possibilities. When an observer observes, the possibilities collapse into actuality. So even Roger Penrose has made the observation that at the large end of things, the place where the buck stops is provided by our conscious perceptions. Roger Penrose is actually been kind of sitting on the fence, at one point getting involved with ideas that consciousness may be involved, but then again, like a lot of other quantum physicists, getting cold feet and walking back into a more comfortable materialist position. But he certainly flirted with the idea that consciousness in some sense was involved at the quantum level. And then there is John Wheeler, very, very highly respected physicist. The universe does not exist out there, independent of all acts of observation. Instead, it is in some sense a participatory universe. Now, it's interesting to note something we'll go into more detail at a later point, but these kind of ideas clearly map directly into ideas within the Buddhist Yogacara, consciousness only, or the later Tibetan Chittamatra, mind only school of psychometaphysics. Here's a quote, for example, from about 2,000 years ago within Buddhist metaphysics. When we see houses and fields in dreams, we think of them as being external objects that are not created by the mind, even though they are nothing other than projections of our mind. all that we see when we are awake are nothing other than a creation of the mind. So we can find actually very similar mechanisms of projection of minds into an immaterial field of potentiality within Buddhist Yogacara philosophy. But that lays for a future point of discussion. Here is another quote from Wheeler. The question is, what is the question? Is it all a magic show? Is reality an illusion? What is the framework of the machine? Darwin's puzzle? Natural selection? Where does space-time come from? Is there any answer except that it comes from consciousness? What is out there? 'Tis ourselves. Or is it all a magic show? And we can put that quote side by side with a quote from Buddhist philosophy. Phenomena, as they appear and resound, are neither established or real, since they keep changing in all possible and various manners, just like appearances in magical illusions. Indeed, one of the early quantum physicists, in fact, the inadvertent instigator of quantum physics, Max Planck, came to exactly this kind of conclusion that Wheeler came to, although, as we shall see later, Wheeler was, how can we put this, he hedged his bets and was somewhat ambiguous in what he really was saying until the very end of his life, when he came out of the closet, so to speak, and became a full-blown quantum mystic. For a lot of his life he said one thing and then took it back, as we shall see later. Going back to Jim Al-Khalili's quantum book here, it's quite interesting this. Max Planck was a very early quantum physicist, but this is interesting. In the early part of Planck's scientific career, and this is from Jim Al-Khalili, Planck was conservative in his views. In the early part of his career, he did not even believe in the existence of atoms. Planck felt that it would soon be proved that matter was continuous, in the sense that it was not ultimately composed of fundamental building blocks, but could be infinitely divided up and still retain its essence. So Planck started out his career believing that the material world which we live in every day was not made up of atoms, it was just internally solid. It had no gaps within it, it had no structure within it. The view which Buddhists rejected 2,000 years ago. But anyway, this was a view that was held at the turn of the century by many people, many physicists. However, at the end of Planck's scientific career, we find him saying this: "As a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you, as a result of my research about the atoms, this much. There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force, which brings the particles of an atom into vibration and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter." And Planck also stated that I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative of consciousness. Now, this is a pure Buddhist position, is Yogacara Buddhism and mind-only Buddhism. And obviously Planck had gone to the opposite conclusion from the way he started out. And he tells us this is because of his involvement in quantum theory. And he is not the only one. Bohr was somewhat, what should we say, mystical. He was ambiguous again, more or less kind of indicating that one couldn't say what existed. But I mean, if you look at what Bohr, if you look at the back of Jim's book, Jim Al-Khalili, anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood it. And this is because in Niels Bohr formulation, matter seems to emerge from a haze of nothingness, or potentiality, should we say. Today, as we shall see, there are still physicists, highly qualified physicists like Henry Stapp, who discuss these issues with Heisenberg. Henry Stapp tells us the following: "We live in an idea-like world, not a matter-like world. The material aspects are exhausted in certain mathematical properties, and these mathematical features can be understood just as well, in fact better, as characteristics of an idea-like structure. There is, in fact, in the quantum universe, no natural place for matter. This conclusion, curiously, is the exact reverse of the circumstances that in the classical physical universe there was no natural place for mind." According to Stapp, these ideas were very much in line with Heisenberg's thinking. And again we see for Stapp, the classical world of matter has dissolved into a world of mind-like potentiality which interacts with consciousness to create the appearance of a material world, which again, I have to say, is exactly the claim of Yogacara metaphysics. Yogacara itself was established 2nd century AD. And yet, if one were to read many texts such as those by Jim Al-Khalili and other materialist-leaning physicists, one would get the impression that such highly qualified physicists are deranged lunatics. There still exists the relatively widely held view that since we do not fully understand quantum mechanics and we do not understand the origin of consciousness, then the two must be related. I have always been surprised at the number of prominent supporters this view has had. But the characterization that Al-Khalili gives here is, again, a fake explanation. It is an attempt to explain away, because this is not the views put forward by Amit Goswami, Henry Stapp, Michael Mensky, to mention another one. They do not make this view. Well, actually, Michael Mensky does say this, but he says it in a much more precise formulation. And there is a much greater depth of explanation and evidence supplied, which is left out when the view is presented in this kind of very vague sense. It is true, actually, Michael Mensky, who's a very highly qualified Russian physicist, does say that in fact we can explain the quantum realm and consciousness by bringing them together like this, but it's not all that he says. He then goes on to give you very cogent reasoning why it is correct to bring the views together. The idea that there is only this kind of vague interconnection is down to a guy called Daniel Dennett, who constantly basically just maligns people and puts up straw man arguments against views he doesn't like. But I'll do a video on Dan Dennett, who, to call him a philosopher is basically, is beyond quantum wishful thinking. But anyway, we'll stop. Often you'll find physicists and philosophers who lean towards a materialist or a subtle materialist, which means it's not materialist in the classical physics view of stuff being completely solid and atoms not existing. Subtle materialism is basically the idea that although the world is weird and kind of immaterial, it's not quite immaterial, it's sort of immaterial, but from the point of view of a subtle materialist physicist or philosopher, consciousness cannot be involved at all. The idea that consciousness is involved is woo-woo. To use, as I say, one of the insults used by materialist philosophers. It is mistaken, even though the evidence that consciousness is, in some sense, significant, is quite significant, as we shall see. However, such materialist and subtle materialist people often present their views as if they were established fact, experimentally verified fact. The world is basically material. Consciousness has nothing to do with it. But this is not the case. consider this short clip, which is a discussion with the physicist Sean Carroll on the Closer to Truth YouTube channel. Take a listen.
Observer, the importance of observer. The observer has been in quantum physics for now getting close to a century, and the original interpretation of Copenhagen, Niels Bohr, was that the kind of almost like an individual, a sentient person has to be involved in quantum mechanics. How has the concept of the observer developed over this time, and what are the issues today?
Yeah, it's a great question because, of course, especially in quantum mechanics, whenever we start talking about what happens in this physical theory, we start talking about observers. But deep in the heart of almost every physicist is the conviction that that shouldn't really be important, right? That the existence of a person, which is what it sounds like when you say the word observer, that shouldn't be part of a real physical theory. So there's
Here you can see that Sean Carroll clearly states that for him and for many physicists, the idea that consciousness has nothing to do with quantum functioning is a personal conviction. A conviction deep in the heart of almost every physicist. This is what he tells us. A similar thing is asserted by Carlo Rovelli in his recent book Helgoland. And yet it's extraordinary that many people seem to think it is an established fact that even though the world is, as Jim Al-Khalidi says, ghostly, at the quantum level, it's also material. Consciousness has nothing to do with it. Be told. If we return to the quote from the introduction of Jim Al-Khalili's book, where he talks about the quantum realm being so strange that even alien abductions are more believable, then when I read this passage, and as far as I know it doesn't seem to strike many people, is that there's a kind of contradiction within the space of a few sentences here. Jim Al-Khalili is telling us that the quantum realm is so weird, so unexpected. In fact, the quantum realm is so weird that alien abductions are more believable than the functioning of the quantum realm. This is an extraordinary realm. And this is the immaterial, ghostly realm from which matter, the everyday world, arises. Weird stuff. But do not think that it has anything to do with psychic phenomena. It may be weird, and it's so weird that alien abductions actually are more believable than quantum phenomena. But psychic phenomena, definitely not. Common sense tells us not. So why, if we're talking about the weirdness, the ghostly weirdness of quantum physics, at one point in a paragraph, suddenly common sense applies? I can tell you the answer. This is lack of scientific integrity. There are certain topics within a certain kind of cabal, we say, of quantum physicists and philosophers, that you're not allowed to discuss within the realm of quantum weirdness. As a reviewer of Rosenblum's and Kuttner's book, Quantum Enigma, points out, in many fields of mainstream science today, the study and even the mere mention of consciousness are still taboo. And the physicist version of a theory of everything does not include consciousness. You can have as much quantum weirdness as you like, but don't you dare bring consciousness or psychic phenomena into it. But this kind of phenomena indicates a kind of schizophrenia that materialist-leaning quantum physicists have to indulge in. On one side, in one personality, they can say quantum physics is weird as they like. Might even involve alien abductions even. But when it comes to certain things involving consciousness, psychic phenomena, common sense rules the day. The great quantum physicist, by some people thought as being one of the greatest physicists, I think, of the 20th century, was John Wheeler. Here's his book, Gion's Black Holes and Quantum Foam. And John Wheeler was a spectacular physicist, no doubt about it. He made major breakthroughs in physics, and he was the mentor to many great physicists, like Richard Feynman, I believe, was under the wing of John Wheeler at one point, and several others, major physicists. However, towards the end of his life, John Wheeler was fond of making very mystical sounding pronouncements on the basis of his knowledge of quantum theory, but then taking them back, clearly worried about the impact such pronouncements would have on his academic status. In the book I'm just writing in the moment, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek, I talk about the academic anti-quantum mysticism thought police. But if you read enough of this stuff, you can see there is a kind of thought police operating. And in fact, Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner, two physicists who've written about consciousness and quantum theory, have actually explicitly talked about the anti-quantum mysticism thought police. They don't call it that, but they may well have done. But there is a kind of thought police operating with the academic community about what is allowed in terms of, quantum metaphysics, and what puts you in the realm of being semi-lunatic woo-woo merchant. I think it was Brian Cox who actually used the term woo-woo merchant in one of his lectures, Christmas lectures. Anyway, back to John Wheeler. Here is John Wheeler's Universal You, which shows an eye looking back backwards in time to the beginning of the universe. And he says, and this is in the context of so-called delayed choice experiment, where the determination of whether a quantum particle is going to be a wave or a particle happens backwards in time. There is an experiment to demonstrate this. We can look at it in another video. But he says, the past history of the universe has no more validity than is assigned by the measurements we make now. Reasoning like this has made me ask whether the universe is a self-excited circuit, a system whose existence and whose history are determined by measurements. By measurement, I do not mean an observation carried out by a human or human-designed instrument, or any extraterrestrial intelligence, or even by an ant or an amoeba. Life is not a necessary part of the equation. So he's claiming that looking back, hence the eye, gives reality at the quantum level to what's happening in the past. But then he quickly says, oh, but I don't mean consciousness, I don't mean life. Then he actually says, the eye could be a piece of mica, it could be a stone. A stone looking back? So when quantum physicists, even great ones like Wheeler, start trying to cover up their tracks to pretend they didn't mean what they clearly did say, because Wheeler does say, my diagram of the big U for universe attempts to illustrate this idea. The upper right end of the U represents the Big Bang, when it all started. Moving down along the thin right leg and up along the thick left leg of the U, symbolically traces the evolution of the universe from small to large. Time enough for life and mind to develop. But hang on, John Wheeler, you just said we don't need life and mind. A stone could do it. So why suddenly now are you talking about life and mind? This is actually an indication, an example of the kind of schizophrenic, obfuscatory wheeling and dealing indulged in by many quantum physicists when they want to give you frisson of, wow, quantum theory is so weird, man. They're all for it. But should you get the idea consciousness, life, mind, psychic phenomena are involved, they get a big stick out. Even though they've said it themselves. The idea that consciousness is involved significantly or even fundamentally in the functioning of the universe is held by several very significant physicists, but overwhelmingly it seems that the physics community, deep in their hearts, Sean Carroll tells us, know that the world is really kind of nothing to do with consciousness. They don't know it from experiment, it's a heart thing. Here is what Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner say about what I call the academic anti-quantum mystical thought, please. In physics departments, a conforming mindset increasingly meant that an untenured faculty member might endanger a career by serious interest in the fundamentals of quantum physics. Even today, it is best to explore the meaning of quantum mechanics while also working a day job on a mainstream physics topic. And of course, I mean, they're talking about just the fundamentals of quantum mechanics there. If you actually start thinking in terms of consciousness being applicable, you're in serious trouble. And yet, very few people realise. Here's an excellent book from Stephen Hawking and Leonard Plotinow, Grand Design. They propose exactly the same quantum metaphysical perspective as Wheeler. Hence their chapter, Choosing Our Universe. Choosing our universe? Choosing? Not only this, what they say is basically that the origin of the universe was a quantum event, and at the moment of the universe coming into semi-existence as a quantum fluctuation, sum over histories. To apply quantum theory to the entire universe, where the observers are part of the system being observed, is tricky, however. In this view, the universe appeared spontaneously, starting off in every possible way. Most of these correspond to other universes. While some of those universes are similar to ours, most are very different. We are the product of quantum fluctuations in the very early universe. We create history by our observation, rather than history creating us. The idea that the universe does not have a unique observer-independent history might seem to contradict with certain facts we know. There might be a history in which the moon is made of Roquefort cheese, but we have observed that the moon is not made of cheese. Hence, histories in which the moon is made of cheese do not contribute to the present state of the universe. There's a spontaneous quantum creation of the universe in which observers are internal to that creation, of course. Thus, we are the product of quantum fluctuations in the very early universe because we're internal. Observers, us, we're choosing our universe. The histories of the universe don't have an independent existence. They depend on what is being measured. We create history by our observations. But if we're creating histories by our observations, obviously those observations are actually operating backwards in time, otherwise they wouldn't be creating histories. both the Wheeler presentation and the quantum metaphysical view, which is contained within the Hawking and Mlodinow book, The Grand Design, have certain commonalities. In essence, both quantum metaphysical views tell us that at the outset of the universe there exists only quantum potentialities. As Hawking and Mlodinow say in The Grand Design, the universe starts out in every possible way. So in other words, the potentialities for everything that could possibly happen are contained at the moment of the quantum fluctuation at the beginning of the universe. It's all there. All possible histories, all possible stories, all possible experiences, all possible species of animals. Very rarely do people realise that quantum physics shows you materialist Darwinism is complete nonsense. Animal species must exist as potentialities at the dawn of time. If Wheeler, if Hawking, if Mlodinow are correct, and it would seem to be that this kind of idea that at the outset of the universe, even Jim Al-Khalili, the materialist, says that basically the quantum realm is ghostly. Ghostly. It's immaterial. It's not yet manifested. So here we have all possibilities. How did it become actualities? Well, as we've seen, Hawking and Mlodinow tell us we choose. Now, of course, they would like to walk that back, and I'm certain Mlodinow does later on. Oh yes, we're just using metaphor. No, you're not. I've looked at the detail. It's quite clear you're claiming that observations backwards in time create what history has become real at the present moment, and the effect radiates backwards in time to weed out certain potentialities, okay? To weed out a Roquefort cheese moon, to leave us with a moon rock moon. Although, to be quite honest, I don't think Hawking and Mlodinow are correct there, because I believe that only the potentialities which can function as a coherent universe are there at the dawn of time. But we can deal with that in another talk. The Wheeler view, the Hawking and Mlodinow view tell us that potentialities for whatever can be experienced and whatever can become an apparent material reality are there as immaterial quantum potentialities at the dawn of time. At some point, it seems that observers start observing in some sense backwards in time, so that a material reality comes into some kind of experienced existence. It's important to realise that what we think is, matter, solid matter, is actually 99.999999. I think it's 13. It's not there really. It's only teetering on the edge of existence. One Tibetan Buddhist teacher said that things do exist, but only just. The world is virtually empty of any material existence, but there is a thin veil of appearance. And that thin veil of appearance seems to be generated through an internal process of observation. This is the picture that arises on the basis of the insights which we saw at the outset of this talk. Jim Al-Khalidi looking at the way that observation seems to materialize quantum particles. It is important to point out, though, that in many New Age type presentations, the idea seems to be that individual people can wander around beaming rays of intentionality to create their own world according to their wishes. This is where, this kind of stuff, The Secret, want money, just realise, read this New Age book on quantum wishing, and once you understand, sit down, do the correct quantum wish, money will fall out of the sky. Obviously, what should we say, making fun. This is not to say that stuff like that does not happen, but it's not as simple as a lot of people would like to believe. It is true that quite extraordinary things can happen, but they depend on a lot of interlocking avenues of, in fact, karmic eventualities. So the world starts out as quantum potentialities, and there is a collective influence by collective consciousness, and this is the Hawking-Lodno view and the Wheeler view. And this collective influence produces a collectively experienced world. It's not individual beings, it is a collective world, or a collectively produced world from quantum potentiality. Here is a quote from Wheeler making exactly that point. Directly opposite the concept of a universe as machine built on law is the vision of a world self-synthesized. On this view, the notes struck out on a piano by the observer participants of all times and all places, bits though they are by themselves, constitute the great wide world of space and time and things. So it is in a collective appearance, and this is exactly what Buddhism, especially Yogacara Buddhism, teaches. The term karma means action. Vipaka means the result of that action. In the Yogacara viewpoint, every perception, every action, every intentional action anyway, leaves a karmic seed, which then can be activated at a later point in time. Such karmic seeds will reside as quantum potentialities. These lay on top of the quantum potentialities which have generated the birth of the universe, which according to Buddhism is a karmic result of previous universes. Again, we'll go into that later. So, according to Buddhism, the entire world was created through latent karmic imprints, When these imprints developed and increased, they formed the earth, the stones, the seas. Everything was created through the development or propagation of these latent karmic potentials. This is a wonderful book. Of Buddhist. This is Dzogchen. It's kind of the interface of Dzogchen and Mahayana by Rongzong Chokyi Zangpo. I'm not sure whether I've got the pronunciation precisely correct. But one of the wonderful things that this book points out is that although it is the case that karmic arisings are illusions, there are different levels of illusions. So, I mean, the illusions that a human being has when they're asleep are not obviously as solid as the karmic arisings of the material world. Some illusions have more, what can you say, solid force, or the appearance of more solid force than others. This is actually an extraordinary insight, because a lot of modern day idealists, such as Bernardo Kastrup, who we'll look at some point, have made a name for themselves presenting what is really Buddhist philosophy, Yogacara. I don't know whether he knows about Yogacara philosophy, but presenting it in a kind of modern Western style. But the impression one gets is that the material world is just as kind of flimsy as the thoughts you might have when you're brushing your teeth in the evening. This is not what is asserted by, as far as I understand, Yogacara. It is certainly not as what is asserted by Rongzong. Certain illusions have a greater degree of force than others because they are collective illusions, not produced by individual beings. This is why the New Age view that individual beings go around collapsing wave functions is misleading. This is an interesting quote from certain physicists will tell you that the moon is produced out of quantum potentiality by perceptions, but it does not mean when nobody's around the moon just disappears. Why? They will tell you that even an object as large as the moon, full of atoms held together by gravity and jiggling about with the random thermal motion appropriate to its temperature, does not exist when nobody's looking at it. Not well put, actually. The moon doesn't disappear when nobody's looking at it. The probability waves spread out very slowly from the states when they were in when they were last observed. The whole moon begins to dissolve away into a quantum ghost. But because the moon is so big, the process is very slow. It doesn't take a few nanoseconds, but millions of years for the moon to dissolve away into quantum uncertainty. That was in a book by John Gribbin. But here again we see that the details of what I call a quantum mind-only perspective are a little more complex than certainly New Age writers generally would lead you to believe, and is far more detailed and evidence than detractors such as Jim Al-Khalili, Sean Carroll, Carlo Rovelli, just to name three, but there are many of them. They don't really take the time to take on the evidence and detailed logic at a significant level. So what is consciousness? This is a often, especially on YouTube, discussed issue. Well, in Buddhism, consciousness is that aspect of the process of reality which is a clear, what should we say, a clear, immaterial agency whose characteristics are emptiness, clarity and cognition. Emptiness indicates that it has no material substantiality. Clarity refers to the way it's experienced when thoughts are pacified in deep luminous meditation. Cognition indicates a kind of inner energetic movement towards knowing. So in a sense, consciousness within a Buddhist context is not thought of as some kind of completely irrelevant nothingness which just kind of hangs out of an excrescence of the banging around of molecules. It is an immaterial energy of its own, with its own validity. It is a fundamental aspect of reality. It is probably the most fundamental aspect of reality. Reality is quantum potentiality with an internal cognitive energy which unfolds quantum potentialities. This is how the Wheeler self-synthesizing universe gets off the ground, and the Hawking, what should we call it, Wheeler type observer created universe also. Of course, quantum physicists like to pretend this all happens without any kind of conscious agency. They just use the term observing or observation without really going into what agency is doing it. Most think that consciousness doesn't exist. For Buddhism, the term consciousness, vijnana, according to one school, is a life force. It is the force of cognition which unfolds quantum potentialities. And if you really want to experience the inner energetic luminosity, the knowingness, if you like, the knowing energy of consciousness, one, you can look at the double-slit experiment where you see it operating, but it doesn't operate through the eyes of experimenters. It is primordial consciousness unfolding the entire scenario, including the experimenters. The experimenters just watching as consciousness, primordial consciousness, does its job, so to speak. The other way to experience the luminosity and inner knowingness, the energetic knowingness of consciousness, is to learn to meditate at a deep level. But it has to be a deep level. There's no New Age. In my experience, the way to experience this kind of intensity of consciousness is to do jhana meditation. Again, you can find out about jhana meditation in many places. There are other ways as well, but a proper method of meditation, in my experience, is required. So, thus ends probably the first talk on the observer effect.